and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. From the time when our large and growing population was seen as a liability, an obstacle to development, to more recent times when much was made of India's potential demographic dividend, to now when the PM in his speech on Independence Day pointed to our growing population as a cause of concern, going so far as to say keeping families small is a sign of patriotism, we seem to have come full circle. The PM's call to do proper family planning is the closest open endorsement of family planning from the political leadership that we've seen in a long time, given the painful memories associated with the aggressive pursuit of population control during the heydays of Sanjay Gandhi. So what is the truth about population? Is it a blessing or bane? Or like most other things in life, somewhere in between? Joining me in discussion are three experts: Niranjan Sagurthi, Director, Population Council of India, New Delhi; Santosh Mehrotra, Professor Economics, JNU; and Pulapre Balakrishnan, Professor Economics, Ashoka University. Welcome to the show, Niranjan, Santosh, and Pulapre. Let me start by asking each of you in turn, were you surprised by the PM's reference to population, and that too as a cause of concern at a time when many believe there is a huge opportunity, a demographic dividend? What do you think could have triggered that kind of talk? Let me start with you, Niranjan.
Yeah, Mythili, I think the one good thing is that the Prime Minister is talking about the population and related concerns, although as a demographer I do not really believe that we need to worry much about the increasing population, because India has achieved the substantial decline in the total fertility rate, and we are at a stage where the population stabilization is going to take place. So but the concern that the Prime Minister has raised and the issue that he is talking about is of a great importance to the country in terms of how we can make best use of the increasing or the huge bulge of the working age population that we have today.
Okay. Do you agree, Pulapre? Why do you think the PM reverted to a subject that many of us have forgotten in the public discourse? Pulapre.
Well, it's always difficult to second guess a politician. I'm sure all politicians have political agendas in mind when they make more statements. However, even though population growth is stabilizing in India and in fact declining, there is a substantial interregional variation, and there are probably parts of the country which could do with some attention being paid to population growth, notably UP and Bihar. In other parts of the country, in the northeast and Kerala, there's actually heading for a population growth which is less than the replacement rate. So there could actually be population decline. So it varies across the country. But I would say really the task now is to equip our population with capabilities, which is basically health and education, rather than worry particularly about population growth.
Okay, Santosh, your quick take on population. Should we worry or not? We'll get into the details a little later, but for now, just a larger question.
I think we should worry for UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, because there it's way above the replacement rate, and these are the very states where the public health system is very weak. And honestly, there is evidence to suggest that there is unmet need for family planning. So honestly, the focus needs to be much more on improving public health at the lower levels and improving preventive and primary health care. And if that was done, honestly, the population growth rate would decline automatically. Otherwise, I think there is a source of concern from these states.
Niranjan, since 2018, India's working age population, that is people between 15 and 64 years of age, is larger than its dependent population, those aged 14 and below or above 65 years of age. As the theory of demographic transition tells us, in most countries, this is the bulge in working population, which in India's case is expected to last till 2055, that has coincided with a period of rapid economic growth. So, should we worry, Niranjan?
You know, to be frank, I don't see much of worry, because India's population today is very youthful, and the median age at India's population, if you see, it's about 27 years. Which means that we have 50% of the total population below that age group. And that's a huge huge advantage in terms of its economic growth. I feel that the next 30 to 40 years we will have this demographic advantage, and I say that we are yet to experience the wealth and the advantage of this bulge in that working age group population. So my take is that it's a huge advantage that we are in today.
Pulapre, one of the winners of this year's Nobel Prize, Michael Kramer, in his studies has shown how a large population is actually a big advantage, contrary to the old Malthusian theories that people of our generation were brought up on. So should we tell policymakers that they can sit back and regard population growth as something that is exogenous in growth, or should they actively intervene? Pulapre.
I think the point quite simply is that we shouldn't be throwing up our hands on our large population. Whether an advantage or not, a large population is with us. There's no question about it. And we should use that population, as for instance China has done. The fact that China has a large population, larger than India, hasn't stood in the way of it becoming much richer than India. But from the point of view of population growth, there is no doubt that theories such as Kramer's and possibly theories which make the argument that large population means a larger number of people who can engage in R&D and the generation of ideas, and therefore technological progress and growth can be higher, can be a little exaggerated. There is these theories generally overlook the impact of population on fixed natural resources. There is no doubt that a growing population puts pressure on natural resources. Santosh also brought up the argument on the public health facilities, but at least the public health facilities can be built by us. Natural resources cannot. And a growing population does put pressure on natural resources. There's no question about that at all.
Except that technology has made many natural resources stretch and stretch, Pulapre. But Santosh, India has about 650 million people in the working age group of 25 to 65, while China is estimated to have 830. But the thing is that by 2040, we would have 170 million more people in this age group than China. So will that help bridge the gap between India and China? We may not quite catch up given the wide difference between us now, but at least it will help us narrow the gap, will it not, Santosh?
Well, that depends entirely, Mythili, upon our ability to create jobs for all these young people who are in working age. Unfortunately, what we are seeing is that we have failed in creating more jobs, especially after 2012. The number of entrants into the labor force has really begun to increase from 2012 onwards, and it will go on increasing from this point onwards, precisely because of the fact that we are in the middle of a demographic dividend. In fact, we are well past our demographic dividend. Our dividend will be over in 20 years. Therefore, it's absolutely critical that we, on the one hand, invest much more in basic and public health to reduce the population growth rate in the northern and eastern states, but more importantly, create jobs. And unfortunately, jobs are not being created because most of our young, we've achieved a very good threshold in terms of education level, enrollment and so on. Now if the investment in health was made, actually we will be able to reduce population growth even further, and we will be able to utilize our demographic, so-called demographic dividend. If we don't invest in our people on the one hand, and at the same time enable growth to take place so that jobs are created. Growth alone doesn't do it. It has to come with jobs, and in the last 6 years jobs have not been growing, and that create a massive risk. It will lead to greater social conflict. Let me make one last point. Because you brought up the comparison with China, let's remind ourselves that China's total population in 1950 was 500 million. Our total population was only 330 million, but we are going to stabilize at a higher population than them. Why? Because they invested in health and education and they created jobs. And unfortunately, we have delayed on all three counts: education, health and job creation.
Of course, Santosh, you're right on that, but there's another important difference. China could enforce that one-child policy. I'm not advocating it, but China could do something that we could not, fortunately. Niranjan, Santosh had a very valid point. Yes, the mere existence of a larger working-age population relative to the dependent population does not necessarily translate into greater prosperity. It is a function of being able to provide them with productive jobs. So should we be focusing on jobs, as he said, rather than population? Or should we focus on both again, as he mentioned? Because if you have fewer people, it would be easier to provide them jobs. Do you agree, Niranjan?
Well, I think we can't be undoing right now at the population size level, but what is critical, as Santosh said, in the case of the North India, for example, we since many of the young population are not getting that quality education, their ability to be into this skilled job workforce is limited. But on the other hand, I keep visiting these field sites in the states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, where I notice that a large majority of the young population have certain aspirations, and the aspirations have to meet in terms of their learning as well as in terms of the skills that they are acquiring, and on the other hand, the opportunities needs to exist at the job level. So as Santosh mentioned, we definitely need to create the jobs, and as of today the estimates suggest that India needs to create at least 10 million jobs for 10 million people every year in order to catch up with the huge volume of people that we have today.
So clearly it is jobs along with population that is a matter of concern, but I'm afraid it's time for us to be in a very short break, but please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with three experts on how should we look at population in the context of the Prime Minister's comment in the Independence Day speech that population is becoming a problem. Pulapuri's success in reining in population growth can be a double-edged sword. Many states, especially in the south, have opposed using the 2011 population census numbers instead of the 1971 used by the earlier finance commissions, saying that they will lose out, and they've written to the president of the country in this respect. In fact, the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, N.K. Singh, is on record that the commission will keep this in mind and is thinking of incentivizing states that have done well on population. Will that restore the balance? And related to that is the fact that will the southern states lose out when the next delimitation is done for parliament? Will they lose what little political voice they have at the moment?
Yes, absolutely. I think both of these are important points. I'm not sure the chairman of the Finance Commission's comment is going to really make much of a difference. I think going back for the government to have gone back on an agreement that the 1977-71 population figures would be taken into account is a bit of a letdown. I mean, and does reward states which have actually grown at a faster rate, when actually the 71 numbers were fixed with a view to restrict population growth. So that's a political move, and it's very unfortunate. And I don't think that's correct. And the delimitation issue is a serious matter, will have implications for how people feel about how they are treated in the country, i.e. states with now delimitation and possibly representation in parliament based on the new population figures would mean that states which have actually grown at slower rates will find themselves less represented. So I think the delimitation should be done very carefully after much more discussion than has actually taken place.
Oh yes, that's going to be a real political hot potato. Because Santosh, it's all very well to say that India is on the cusp of a demographic dividend. By 2020, the average age of the Indian is expected to be about 29 years compared to 37 for China, 48 for Japan. But it's obviously not enough, as we discussed before, just to provide jobs. People also need to have the requisite skills needed. So how do we match education and skill levels? And why have we not succeeded despite so many years of trying? Santosh.
I think a very important reason why we are not succeeding in skills is because we have not succeeded in revamping our vocational education and training institutions. Unfortunately, our TVET institutions, vocational education training, are supply driven, government managed, government financed. You know, in countries, the evidence is that in countries where the TVET systems are demand driven, industry managed, industry financed, and where industry is genuinely engaged in the skills ecosystem, that's when the skill training is effective. Unfortunately, the government has not managed to think seriously enough about this, and unless we do so, we are not going to turn this around, because there are millions who have completed secondary education and now higher secondary and going on to general academic tertiary, and these are becoming unemployable. So the data on educated unemployment is absolutely frightening. Between 2012 and 2018, for youth between 15 and 29, the open unemployment rate actually tripled from 6.1% to about 18%. And with higher your level of education, the higher the possibility that you will be unemployed, openly unemployed. This is clearly showing two things. One, that the school education and the general academic tertiary education is of poor quality and it's creating unemployables. And so we have to divert these the youngsters early on into vocational education. This is point one. And only if we get industry involved to a much greater extent, we have to incentivize industry. There are ways of doing this where we get industry involved, then the quality of training and vocational education will improve, and hence their employability will improve, because even technical vocational education graduates are facing unemployment rates of 35 and 36%.
Oh, absolutely. We're sitting on a tinderbox. That's very, very true, Santosh. But Niranjan, now let me just move to a somewhat more touchy subject, the role of really cross-border migration. India is not unique in its worries on this score. If the US is worried about Mexicans coming to the US, India has concerns about Bangladeshi migrants. But are the numbers really large enough to warrant anxiety? Or do migrants, as many studies have shown, contribute really to the economic activity in the host country, Niranjan?
Well, I think the issue is more about how much the migration is happening and to what extent the fertility levels are high when we say about the population increase. But it's important to kind of consider the access to the services to the migrants as well. One of the things that I mean, talking about migration, I would rather say that in our country itself, there is a huge migration that is taking place from the states in northern India to the southern India. If there is no migration, some of the works that needs to be done in southern part of India would not be done, and there is that people's mobility that could happen from one place to another place. But what is critical is to make sure that we have the access to health services, to access to the education, which is a basic human right that's being provided in the country. It's up to the political fraternity to take the steps that are needed for about the cross-border migration, but the independent in terms of the demographers' view is that the migration is an integral part of the population, and that keeps happening, and that's where we need to make sure that the young population receives the services and gets adequate information so that they're making right choices about how many children do they need to have and when do they need to have, and that thereby reducing the fertility and contributing to the increased economic growth.
Pulapra, India is really not one country in many, many ways, especially when it comes to social indicators. So we've seen much greater success in population control in the southern states, for example, and we've seen much larger working age population in northern states, northern and eastern states. So if we were to apply the same theory of demographic dividend and all the rest of it, have these northern states, are they now getting the benefit of a larger working age population vis-a-vis the southern states like Kerala, which now have the opposite problem of a large dependent population? Pulapra.
To some extent, yes, we are seeing that. But the fact is, interestingly enough, the northern states are able to reap the demographic dividend because they're able to find employment in southern India. You know what I'm trying to say? So somewhere within the system, jobs must be generated. Yeah, and we're back to the issue of the generation of jobs being absolutely important for the demographic dividend to be realized. Otherwise, you just have the supply without the demand for these workers.
Santosh, China has seen much faster growth in per capita income, partly due to its harsh one child per couple policy. But now that the same policy is coming back to haunt that country because of its rising level of dependency ratios, what should we or what can we learn from that? Is that the stick is not the answer?
Well, first of all, I think it's misleading to talk about China's population slowdown being caused mainly by one-child policy. I don't believe that that is the case. That was a last-minute, effort to actually bring the population growth rate. Their population growth rate was coming down in any case because in Mao's China, and even since then, they had maintained an investment in health and education, which had brought down the demand for children from families. So the one-child policy helped that. Now, I don't think we need to go the China route at all. The problem in our northern and eastern states is relatively poor governance, as a result of which lower investment rates, as a result of which lower GDP growth rates. And that, combined with the poor health facilities and the public health system being very weak in most of the northern and eastern states, you have this growing divide and divergence within our country. And on the subject of which is the cause of the migrations, and I want to say one thing about the migration which you brought up earlier. You see, unfortunately, the NSS has not done in our country a migration survey since 2007-8. This is unacceptable. We really need desperately a migration survey, so we begin to understand this phenomenon at a greater level of granularity. The cross-border migration is only one small part of this migration. In our country, the migration is taking place on a huge scale, which is causing massive issues around, first, job growth, second, urban growth, which is becoming leading to sprawl and slums. Sprawling cities are not efficient cities. Dense cities are efficient cities. And so we have multiple problems arising from migration, but we have very little information about migration. So I think first we need to solve for the data problem in respect of migration by getting NSS to give us information.
Oh yes, we need data on jobs, we need data on migration, and we need data on a host of things. It's also perhaps on GDP, another very touchy subject. Niranjan, my last question to really was on migration inwards. But what about outward migration? Could part of the solution really lie for countries like India in other countries being more open to free movement of people on the lines of free movement of goods? Today, most countries are not open to allowing free movement of people, even though their higher dependency ratios compel them to actually think and act differently. When can we hope that will change, Niranjan?
Well, I think even without saying that there is this free movement of people to certain countries that is taking place from India, there is a whole lot of this brain drain that we used to talk in back in days, and that's when the issue is that how do we encourage the people to have that level of free mobility, not only outside the country but also to the country, because in the form of this globalization, we while and in the economic growth, the country can actually prosper with the increased migration and mobility. It's in countries like China and many other countries, there is that level of mobility and the migration that has taken place along with the trade, and those are things that will continue to happen in India too as going forward, because there are a whole lot of aspirations that the young population of India today has, and those aspirations are not limited, and we have to wait and see in the next 30 years from now. There will be a huge mobility of population from one country to another country, and India is going to play a big role in the global development.
Let me quickly toss that same question to both of you, Pulapre and Santosh. Is outward migration the answer? Pulapre.
Well, I'm not sure it's the answer, but India is the country which receives the largest volume of remittances globally, one. And secondly, remittances are a larger source of inflows, income flows into India than even from the IT sector, which gives you an idea how important actually remittances are for us in the country. So answer or not, it's something which we certainly need for some time to come.
Santosh, freer movement of natural people, as WTO puts it. Santosh, is that part of the answer?
You know, for smaller countries like Bangladesh, that might be a bit of an answer because, for instance, they add about 2 million people to the labor force, 700 million people leave, in fact. But we add many more people to the labor force, and there's not a hope in hell that the world can absorb that kind of number of people that we have looking for jobs. So I don't think we can encourage that. That's going to happen on its own. Honestly, we've got to worry about trying to ensure that the northern states improve their health systems very quickly so that unmet need for family planning services is met as quickly as possible if we want to bring population growth down on the one hand, and on the other hand, more jobs in the northern and eastern states in particular.
Okay, so we need to look at population in a much more granular fashion, both geographically and also from the point of view of health as well as job creation. Thank you so much, Pulapre, Santosh, as well as Niranjan, for joining me in the discussion. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.